Chapter 19, Safe for Democracy, the United States and World War I, 1916 to 1920, Part 5. Fervent hopes for social change and disappointment with the war's aftermath went beyond the black community. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union as Russia was renamed after the revolution, Lenin's government nationalized landholdings, banks, and factories and was proclaimed a workers' state. The Russian Revolution and democratic longings unleashed by World War I sent hope and fear throughout the world. The year 1919, like 1848 and 1968, was a year of global social and political unrest. Inspired by Lenin's call for revolution, communist-led governments came to power in Bavaria, which was part of Germany and Hungary, and general strikes demanding wartime promises of industrial democracy shook Belfast, Glasgow, and Winnipeg. Anarchist peasants seized land in Spain, and Indian crowds challenged British imperial rule, as did nationalist movements in other European colonies. Opponents to change mobilized, including the Allied powers, who saw the Soviet government as a threat, and sent expeditionary forces that included American troops to aid Lenin's opponents in the Russian Civil War. Wilson's policy toward the Soviet Union showed the contradictions of liberal internationalism. Wilson wanted to foster trade with the new government, but his fear of communism as a source of international instability and a danger to private property led him to military intervention. The Allies did not invite the Soviets to peace talks at Versailles, and Wilson refused to recognize the Soviet government. Anti-communism remained a basic feature of 20th century U.S. foreign policy. 1919 also saw an enormous turmoil in America. Amid racial violence and devastating flu epidemic, a bombing campaign targeted the homes of prominent Americans. More significant was an upsurge in the labor movement, as workers took Wilson's promises of industrial democracy and freedom seriously. In 1919, more than 4 million workers went on strike, the greatest wave of labor unrest in U.S. history. They faced an unprecedented mobilization of employers, government, and private patriotic organizations. The strike wave began in January in Seattle, where a shipyard workers' strike became a general strike that paralyzed the city. In September, Boston police went on strike, and Governor Calvin Coolidge fired the entire force and called out the National Guard. A massive coal strike was ended only by a federal injunction. The 1919 steel strike was the era's greatest labor revolt. Centered in Chicago, it brought together 365,000 mostly immigrant workers who demanded union recognition, higher wages, and an 8-hour workday in an industry that arbitrarily treated workers and suppressed all union activity. During the war, large numbers of workers joined the Steel Workers Union, and by the end of 1918, they had won the 8-hour day. But employers resumed opposing the union after the war, and they responded to the strike by appealing to nativism amongst native-born workers, many of whom returned to work, and by painting the union and strike as inspired by the IWW, communism and disloyalty. Public opinions turned against the strikes, along with police attacks, led to the strike's defeat in early 1920. Though many progressives hoped wartime economic planning would continue after 1918, the Wilson administration rapidly dismantled agencies that controlled industrial production and the labor market. Yet the wartime repression of dissent persisted and peaked in the Red Scare of 1919 through 1920, which was inflamed by the post-war strike wave and social tensions and fears caused by the Russian Revolution. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, certain that the steel strike was part of a global communist conspiracy, ordered federal raids on radical and labor organizations, led by the young director of the Radical Division of the Justice Department, J. Edgar Hoover. More than 5,000 were arrested, most without warrants, and held for months without charge. The government deported hundreds of immigrant radicals, including Emma Goldman. This assault on civil liberties was so extreme that heavy criticism was leveled at Palmer by Congress and the press, and the scare dissolved. Though it generated a new concern for civil liberties in the 1920s, the Red Scare successfully destroyed radical groups such as the IWW and Socialist Party. Wilson's failure to gain a just peace at Versailles based on his 14 points exacerbated many progressives' sense that the war would not fundamentally transform society and government. In late 1918, Wilson traveled to France for the Versailles Peace Conference and was welcomed by ordinary Europeans as a hero. But while Wilson's 14 points had called for open diplomacy, the Versailles talks were held in secret. The Versailles Treaty did not accomplish all of Wilson's goals, but it did accomplish some of his hopes, including the establishment of a League of Nations to supervise a new international order, and it applied national self-determination to Eastern Europe, making new nations from the ruins of the defeated Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany. But despite Wilson's opposition to a peace based on territorial acquisition or revenge, the Versailles Treaty included both, virtually guaranteeing future conflict. France won the right to occupy iron and coal-rich regions of Germany. Strict limits were imposed on Germany's future army and navy, and Germany was required to make reparation payments so high they devastated the German economy. The war damaged Europeans' claims to be a higher civilization with the right to rule lesser peoples and elevated the international prestige of the United States. Wilson's language of self-determination inspired minority groups and colonial peoples across the world, but they took this rhetoric more seriously than he did. Wilson's idea of an equality of nations clashed with European rulers' wishes to rebuild their empires in the post-war period. They rejected the appeals of colonial figures for independence, such as Han, the future Ho Chi Minh, who went to Versailles to ask for freedom from French colonial rule. The British and French had no intention of applying self-determination to their colonies. The Ottoman Empire was divided into nations such as Syria, Iraq, and Palestine, over which British and French were given mandates to govern. Former German colonies in Africa were given to South Africa, Australia, and Japan, and Ireland was not given its independence. Widespread disappointment among colonial peoples that the 14 points had not been applied to the non-European world created cynicism regarding the West's language of freedom and democracy. Wilson's apparent capitulation to the claims of European empire sparked popular anti-Western nationalist movements across the world, including the May 4 movement in China and the Communist movement in Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. Lenin, in fact, spoke of the right of nations to self-determination before Wilson, and with the end of the Wilsonian moment, Lenin's reputation supplanted that of America's president. These movements, whether or not they were communist, signaled the emergence of anti-colonial nationalism as a major force in the 20th century. Ironically, when colonial peoples demanded to be recognized as independent members of the international community, they invoked the legacy of the American Revolution as the first colonial struggle to establish an independent nation, and Wilson's language of self-governing and equal nation-states as the most legitimate form of government and world order. Wilson, upon returning to the United States from Versailles, saw the League of Nations as the war's most important legacy. But many Americans feared that the League membership would force the U.S. into an open-ended commitment in the affairs of other nations. Wilson argued that the United States could not save the world without being continually involved with it. His opponents, led by Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, argued that the League would limit America's freedom of action. Wilson refused to compromise, and in the midst of the League debate, he suffered a massive stroke that left him incapacitated. His wife Edith effectively assumed his office for 17 months. The Senate twice rejected the Versailles Treaty. In the war's immediate aftermath, the United States retreated from international affairs. Over the long term, however, Wilson's idealism and power politics shaped the fundamentals of American foreign policy in the 20th century, a commitment to democracy, open markets and trade, and America's special mission to instruct the world in freedom, and the will for military intervention abroad to promote American interests and values. But the war had not made the world safe or democratic. It undermined freedom in the United States, and it led to the defeat of progressivism. Republican Warren G. Harding, part of the party's conservative wing, and elected president in 1920, repudiated Wilsonism and promised to return to normalcy, thus inaugurating one of the most conservative decades in the nation's history.